Hi all, I hope you're well. This is a repeated recording of the workshop that I just gave before. There were some internet issues that happened, and even more importantly, delivering it a second time around will mean that's more precise. So, if anything, this is great news. Just a few pieces of housekeeping before I carry on. The first thing is that it's just very important for everyone to recognize that I come from a particular place in the world with my judging and debating. I come primarily from the European circuit. I've also judged and debated in the North American circuit and in the Asian circuit, but to a lesser extent. So many of my observations about judges might be region dependent in terms of, for instance, what they credit as an extension, what they think is sufficient to win over an opening team, etc., etc., etc. The second thing that I want to note, which is relevant, is that in terms of all of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today, there's been a great amount of help from other people who have contributed towards my understanding of debate or who have even talked about some of these specific ideas. So I'd like to thank Darian Hotan in particular for his discussion with me on the principled argument section of this workshop, as it was very, very helpful. The third thing is just that if you find the stream and the document that's attached very helpful, please consider donating towards a charitable cause, either a local COVID charity, even things like poverty relief because of COVID being quite significant, or also thinking about donating to the Against Malaria Foundation, which I had linked in my Facebook group and will put in the description of this video itself. With all of that housekeeping out of the way, we're going to chat about three different things. First, I want to talk about principled arguments. In particular, I'm going to be building on things that have been said before in workshops. So there are links to Ashish and Lucia's videos on principled arguments. They're all very, very intelligent and very useful. So those are resources that you should definitely use. And I'm only covering things that weren't discussed in those videos. So you'll find that a lot of my discussion on the principles are going to be supplementary towards what was discussed before. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is how we extend and narrow motions. And I define a narrow motion as one where all the significant mechanisms can be run by the opening team, because that seems to be what judges care about nowadays. And the last thing that I'm going to chat about and really thoroughly go through is Fiat and how exactly we can use Fiat in a way that helps to limit the debate, which is advantageous. So let's start with the first of the three. Let's talk a little bit about principled arguments. On principled arguments, I think it's important to just talk about the value of a principled argument at the very top. Principled arguments ignore the practical quagmire that can come earlier in the debate. How do people behave? What do people value? How will states behave? All of these complicated questions about how different groups might act are inherent in practical arguments, but in a principled argument, you can just run an argument that overrides everything, because if something is morally wrong or principally wrong, that's the end of it. There's no further discussion. We ought not do something that is immoral. That is the point of a principled argument. Now, there are a couple of constraints that exist on principled arguments. The first is that debaters are bad at making principled arguments, and this has really large long-run implications because it means that you don't have the same mental shortcuts. If, for instance, someone said, aha, the social contract, you know what that means instantly within a debate round. Whereas in contrast, if you make a complicated principled argument that hasn't been heard before, your language has to be exactly precise in order to communicate the claim. The second thing is that judges just don't credit or value principled arguments. And this is for a variety of reasons, but I think it's just that at a pre-rational level, most people think of the world in a utilitarian lens. And that means that we automatically assume that utilitarianism is correct. Now, I'm going to try and disprove that intuition, but that is the challenge. And these things end up being really problematic because what makes debates tight or narrow is the fact that we can't run as many arguments. So I personally do not like the position CG. And I think the reason why I don't like it is just because the number of permissible arguments that can be run in debate isn't large enough to cover the ability to make extensions in many motions. So we're going to try and unpack that and make sure that that isn't a problem. 6 things then in this principled workshop. The first thing is on the methodology of thought experiments. And a thought experiment is not just an example. It's not just something that should not be credited because it isn't logical. And the reason why is because all logic stems from intuition. I mean, we have to agree in some kind of basic moral premise. For instance, murder is wrong. If there's any moral theory that says murder is wrong, then we automatically think that is an incorrect moral theory. But there's no rational reason why we think murder is wrong, other than the philosophy that we construct after the fact to fit that thought experiment. And so for someone to dismiss any other thought experiment is just for them to use their intuition in a way that I think discredits other kind of moral premises that people can believe and that have been logically defended extensively within literature. So thought experiments should just be valued in and of themselves. And they have to be, importantly, very, very persuasive. They need to really sell something to the judge. And the language that you use with principled arguments is particularly important, as Lucia and Ashish have noted before. So I want to chat now about how we have a good thought experiment and how we can use thought experiments. A good thought experiment is something that is precise and accurate at stripping away all of the irrelevant features and trying to find the morally salient or relevant point. So in Lucia's video, she talks about the example of incest, and we just feel some kind of immediate disgust towards that idea. Let me posit a thought experiment that's meant to try and kind of take away some of the things that we think are objectionable and determine what exactly we think is wrong. So imagine the following scenario. There's a brother and a sister who have sex with one another. They don't know that they're related. They've never met before. In fact, one of them was adopted, so, no interaction really. Both of them are infertile, so they can't have a child. The question is this wrong? Not just does this make you feel uncomfortable or does it seem gross, but is it morally wrong? And what this thought experiment attempts to strip away are two common complaints: the power dynamics within relationships and the biological argument that exists. And given that most people's intuition is it's not wrong, it might be icky, but it's not wrong, that means that the real problem that is associated with incest is that blanket, it's a blanket rule to prevent things like physical deformity and power imbalances. And I think it's important to note that the ickiness then is probably just constructed as a social conditioning that exists within a society based on the fact that we disagree with those two parts of it, the power dynamics and the physical deformities that might come about. Now, thought experiments are also great when you use multiple to try and tease out intuitions. I'm going to do this a lot throughout the video, but let me give you an example of what I mean, because thought experiments help you to show the delineation of what you really care about. Thought experiment 1. You're stranded on a deserted island. You have nothing to eat. Your only option is to eat a bear. Is this morally permissible? Most people say yes. Even lots of environmentalists would say yes. And a justification that an environmentalist might use is that this is based on the principle of necessity. You're defending yourself from the elements. Some might even call this the principle of self-defense. But let's look at another example. You're stranded on a deserted island. You have nothing to eat. Your only option is to eat a fellow human who has not consented. Now, is that morally permissible? And most people would say no. I mean, perhaps you should be forced to find a method by which you both agree, something like drawing a straw or playing rock, paper, scissors to determine who is eaten. But it seems that there's something wrong, something immoral about the idea of stripping away a human's dignity, of just on the basis of something like maybe being stronger, something completely arbitrary. So while necessity is a justification of eating the animal in the first thought experiment, it isn't the only justification. There's implicitly an idea of moral value that we accord to humans versus animals. If it's morally permissible to eat an animal in those circumstances, but not morally permissible to eat a human, it must be about moral status, not just necessity and self-defense. So the importance of this is that a thought experiment which is used well, in contrast with other thought experiments, can help explain why we feel a certain way. And that means that you can get a more refined version of morality. Even more importantly, you can use this in any debate round. If you want to find differences between two circumstances on a pragmatic basis, like For instance, why does country X that is similar to country Y deal with problems differently? You can just compare the two and find the differences, the similarities, and really draw out what exactly is the separation between the two instances. All right, so that's thought experiments. Let's chat a little bit now about Korsgaard and Kant on the rational will and humanity. And this is a section that is massively benefited from a conversation that I had with Darian Hotan. So huge credits to him. He did a fantastic job in making this argument in the very first place within Iona and popularizing it. And I think that he is an exceptional mind. So thank you so much. To begin this section, I want to ask, what makes us human? And correspondingly, what gives us value? What makes our lives valuable? Most people wouldn't say that's just following our natural inclinations or our natural desires, things like eating because we're hungry or having sex or anything like that. No, something that gives us a human value, something like meaning, is our ability to make choices of the goals that we think are fulfilling. Someone might choose to sacrifice their physical well-being. They might not sleep enough, they might eat too little, and all they really want to do is something fulfilling, like writing a book. More importantly, it's unclear whether or not trying to reach for that fulfilling thing will even make you that happy, because most psychological studies say, hey, our happiness reverts to the mean very quickly after a huge accomplishment. Now, most forms of utilitarianism say that it would be wrong to pursue those fulfilling goals, that you have less utility, that you aren't as happy, all those sorts of things. But the average person thinks that part of what gives us value are the things that we ascribe value to and the goals that we pursue. And importantly, many of these fulfilling objectives are not objectively good for everyone. It's only given value because each individual chooses it. Now, this is an intuition which forms the foundation of the Korsgaardian interpretation of Kant. A purely utilitarian view leaves us devoid of the human identity that makes us human, complete beings. It reduces us to just natural phenomena acting through us. We're just conduits for natural phenomena. In the same way that if a lightning bolt hits a tree and it falls over, we're just responding to the natural desires that we have, things like being hungry. Nothing morally significant, nothing valuable, just acting. And therefore, to say that we should prioritize things like our physical inclinations or utility is to rob us of what makes us human, to rob us of the rational will. And if it is true that the rational will is the only thing that has value because it chooses, it ascribes value to, then the only reason why utility could be good is because someone chose to prioritize utility, that they chose to live a hedonistic lifestyle, for instance. And this is a really important implication because it says that any violations of the human will, things like violence, lying, deception, manipulation, all of those sorts of things are deeply wrong and deeply immoral. So that's an intuition. But why ought we care about exercising our free will? I mean, one justification is that it adheres in the human nature, that to be a good human, to live a good human life, to be able to experience what it is to be a human, is to embark upon the exercise of the rational will. Another is that the human will is the only unconditioned good. Now, unlike preferences, which are arbitrary and capricious, or even virtues like courage, or good things like wealth, all of those things are contingent on something else, right? My courage is only good if I use it for the right causes instead of fighting against noble and just people. And so the human will is a good in and of itself because it allows us to choose what we value. It's the precondition by which anything has actual value in relation to us as individuals, and everything else is potentially good, but oftentimes bad. So think about the following intuition pumps which help to demonstrate this. Think about death. Most of us probably, although not all of us, but many of us probably believe that euthanasia is just. And what transforms the unjust act of murder into the just act of euthanasia is consent, the ability to choose our ends. Another good example is just thinking about other philosophical foundations. Things such as the social contract or Kant's notion of the veil of ignorance and coming to a decision in the original position. All of them invoke the idea that consent and choice are essential. And if consent and choice are essential, if they're the things that legitimize the moral theories of the day, then it suggests to us that the ultimate determinant of all goods, the most important thing, is the free will that enables us to make those choices. Now, this is obviously a very, very interesting sounding argument, philosophically sound, and it in many ways actually is logically quite difficult to penetrate. I'm going to cover a few different objections and try and defend it, and I'll admit where I think that there are some degrees of uncertainty about how successful the defense to the objection is. Objection number one, the capacity objection. And by the way, these are all labels that I've made myself. So if you're writing an academic article or something like that, please, you probably want to make sure that you are thinking of the terminology that's formally used. But anyways, the capacity objection. So one objection to Korsgaard's argument is that this implies groups who don't possess rational will, that they're not deserving of any moral status. And the argument is as follows. If what grants anything value is our ability to rationally choose it, then what about animals, or on a stronger objectional level, those who have severe developmental disorders who don't have the same capacity for rational choice as the prototypical human in Kant's ideology is? Are these groups valuable? Well, you can construct an argument as to why they're valuable still, and I think that there are two different constructions. One is kind of playing, a little bit hard and loose with the ideology and the arguments that Korsgaard uses. This is actually applied in a different part of the book, but it's cross-applied here, and I think there are some morally suspect parts to it, but it will sound good in a debate. And the thing that is important to note is that we judge people and things on their properties and their characteristics. We don't judge a knife on whether or not it could be moral, because straightforwardly it can't be moral. What we judge about it is that it's sharp enough to cut something. And we judge humans on the idea of morality and the rational will because we possess that capability and that characteristic. But that doesn't imply that we would judge something that doesn't have rational will as unimportant or non-valuable. Rather, they're valuable based on other sets of criteria and properties that they demonstrate. And as a consequence, that means that they also have some degree of moral value, that they can have some degree of importance. And so that means that, for instance, someone with developmental disorder does not have no value because they have no rational will. Rather, they have a different set of value based on different criteria. That's what Korsgaard might argue. I think, moreover, Korsgaard argues that the ability to have a free will, the ability to reason, to choose, is what means that we should extend our sympathies to animals or those with developmental disorders as one of our ends. That we are able to generate moral obligations and pick the welfare of vulnerable groups who can feel. And that is also a way in which they become ends that are valuable and have moral value and status. However, I think it does seem a little bit dodgy that their moral value would only be accounted for based on an individual choosing them as ends rather than inherently. So that's one, I think, suspect part of that argument. The second objection is the origin objection. And the idea is that merely because the human will is a precondition for other things to have value, it doesn't imply that the human will itself has value. So it may be the case that utility has no good until it is valued by the human will, but that doesn't imply that the human will is valuable itself. But the question is, if that is true, then what does have value? If there are no alternative sources of moral meaning or fulfillment but the human will, then how can you say anything has value? The only thing that could have value on a moral metric is the human will then. So consider the following thought experiment, right? This is to prove that, for instance, the abstract notion of happiness has no value unless we choose it. The example is this. Psychologists have discovered the optimal way to induce pleasure in someone's mind. They hook a person up to a machine that gives pleasurable experiences. No one hooked up to it can tell the difference between reality and the machine. The state forcibly hooks everyone up to it. Is this a morally permissible option? Most people would say that it is wrong for the state to force you to live like that. That what helps determine the morality of something is your ability to choose it. Now, understandably, lots of people object to the pleasure machine inherently. But at the same time, I don't think that anyone would judge someone as immoral or as wrong for choosing the pleasure machine. Even if they did, the intuition is that it was worse to have been forced into it versus choosing. Because what happens is the subjugation of the rational will into choosing something that's inauthentic, not good. And even if it maximizes our happiness, even if it's for our own good, it's still wrong. So you can apply this pretty straightforwardly in any debate about policies that are meant to help the people. Things like even bans on alcohol or bans on drugs, those presuppose that we are legitimate in taking away someone's choice with the state's coercive power through the police and other institutions jailing and preventing people from exercising their free will. Cool. Now, the second thing that is important to discuss is what about the circumstance in which you negate someone else's choice to further your own ends? I mean, this straightforwardly seems wrong all the time, but the utilitarian actually says it's okay. Like if I really, really enjoyed punching Chin, so much more than he experienced a lack of pleasure. In fact, let's say that he was in a coma, he didn't feel it. Punch away, Jason, is what the utilitarian would say. So that is the intuition that the utilitarian needs to stand by. And so we need to construct an alternate reason as to why it's not right to do that. And Korsgaard argues that our reason to be moral is partially about taking our own humanity seriously. And the way that we take our own humanity seriously, take ourselves seriously as ends in and of themselves, is by trying to further our own ends. And the argument that she uses is that the way that we show our friends or our loved ones that we value them is by helping them with their ends. Helping them with their job application, making sure that that person has enough food on the table, like lots of immigrant parents showing their love. And if that's the case, the only way that we have self-respect is by trying to further our own ends. And that is an act of taking our own humanity seriously, because the way that we further our own ends is by using the rational will. We recognize the rational will as fundamental and important. But if we take our own humanity seriously, if we think humanity is just broadly important, then we have to recognize that everyone's humanity is fundamental. And thus, in that case, it's wrong to treat your ends as more important than another's ends. This is a bit philosophically wanky. I don't think you need to run the argument. I think it's quite complex. You might have to actually go through the video again or read some primary literature. And honestly speaking, I personally am not a huge fan of the argument, so I don't think I sell it as well as I possibly could. But you could probably also just get away with, if you think the human will is the most important thing, then it's always wrong to violate someone else's human will. And then you can probably still be fine. A secondary approach as well to this whole origin objection, and to particularly the issue of whether or not you should value someone else, is the self-constitution argument. So everyone's judged as having value on the basis of the properties that they have. Part of being a good human is being able to abide by rational laws that you set out for yourself through the rational will or through choosing things. If you are not abiding by that rational will in a logical way, then you're not fulfilling the purpose you ought to. You are a bad agent, a bad human, a bad person, and therefore you need to be moral. That's basically the argument. Okay, the third objection is the consequentialism objection, and the argument is basically this. Things are only valuable because people value them, then we're just protecting consequences. We just want people to be able to choose the best ends. It's a classic choice argument, if anything. That might be a way you can frame the argument, but that's not Korsgaard's view. And Korsgaard's view here is that what really matters is the thing that helps us determine what has value. It's not the ends in themselves. It's the human will, because it's the thing that enables the ends to even be important. And this is a crucial observation because this allows Korsgaard to maintain the separateness of persons. And the separateness of persons is a basic idea. You shouldn't be able to use someone else as a means to an end, even if it leads to greater utilitarian good. So For instance, there's no right for me to have a slave, even if that slave made my life vastly better and gave me more utility, because I can't just add and subtract total amounts of utility levels. Each and every individual person has importance that needs to be considered and protected. So, under that view, we have to protect each and every person's human will. And that means that you can't have that kind of utilitarian maximization that occurs, which is so objectionable to so many philosophers. Okay, the fourth objection, the social conditioning objection. So one critique of Korsgaard is that it isn't entirely clear whether there's a wrong committed by shaping what someone values as their ends. So for instance, social conditioning, in comparison to denying someone their ends. So for instance, being able to use force or violence to stop someone from doing what they want. Now, before I get into some thought experiments to illustrate what exactly is the concern that Korsgaard has, you need to consider what the point of all of this is. And the point is that you are prohibited from violating someone's rational will. Okay, this is very important, their rational will. So, 3 illustrations or 3 thought experiments. Thought experiment 1. I have a strong desire to drink milk. Someone uses force to take my will away. Under K's formulation, this is awful, negates my choice of will. Very, very bad, even if the other person really, really likes the milk. More than I do. Okay, second, I live in a society where milk is strongly disliked. I pick up the social cue from other people, and it's a view that gradually becomes more and more ingrained. Now, under Korsgaard's formulation, this might be seen as wrong, but the average person says that's probably okay. No one is committing a wrong in this instance. How can it be that someone changing my preferences unintentionally is harmful, especially if it's not any individual person, but a collective mass of society? So imagine this third circumstance. I've been physically brainwashed by someone to believe milk is neither desirable nor good. Now, under almost all accounts of morality, that just seems wrong. It seems a little bit icky. But why is it icky? How can we rationally distinguish it from the second case? Well, there are 2 reasons. First, social conditioning does not preclude your rationality. Even if there are influences on your decisions, you are still able to exercise the rational will and make decisions. If anything, social conditioning is like any other external factor that influences my choices. It is a reason for or against something, but not a replacement of my ability to rationally think. But in contrast, brainwashing or manipulation happens at a sub-rational level. It strips me away of my ability to think rationally because it misinforms me or it forces me into something without any influence of the rational will. Therefore, wrong. A second argument is that social conditioning doesn't display a lack of respect for someone. There's no intent to change someone's mind or violate the will. But if there is an intent to disregard one's will by, brainwashing someone, that's wrong, and it shows disrespect. So, how exactly are all these arguments applied in debates? Seems pretty trivial, but any debate that asks you not to torture someone or not to murder someone or not to force someone into a decision that is good for them will invoke this. For instance, the classic debate about torturing terrorists for information to try and help a city where that terrorist has laid a bomb underneath it. That's a good example where the Kantian would say you can't torture them. Seems like a bizarre outcome. Kantianism does, I think, regularly get criticized for the example of the murderer at the door, where if a murderer comes to your door and asks you where your friend is to murder them, you're morally obliged not to lie. Some philosophers manage to get around this, like Korsgaard herself. The philosophical argument is too deep, but there are some interesting implications. All right, so that is the non-utilitarian argument. And the importance of this is just that it's pretty easy to find and poke holes with utilitarianism. It's hard to construct an alternate moral theory. So for instance, with utilitarianism, it's pretty easy to poke holes because oftentimes you can just give thought experiments like, well, is it right for me as a doctor to take in someone who's coming in for a routine surgery, kill them, take their organs, give it to 5 people to make sure those 5 people live? Or the example of utility monsters. So basically someone receives a lot more utility than everyone else. Utilitarianism says all the resources go to them. No point in giving it to other people because they don't experience the utility at the same level. We're trying to construct an alternate moral theory here. All right, the third topic of philosophy here is the person-affecting view and respect. And related to the issue that we've discussed is the person-affecting view, because the person-affecting view is a very particular brand of utilitarianism. What is the person-affecting view? It says that a state of affairs cannot be worse, or an action that moves to that state of affairs cannot be wrong, if no person is worse off as a consequence. So, good example of this is with something like attempted murder, right? In the case of attempted murder, if the person doesn't get shook by it, doesn't really care, there's no wrong committed in the world of the utilitarian or the person affecting view. No one got hurt. Even if the person was offended or hurt or got scared, if I was reaching for my phone in my pocket and pulled out my phone, but the other person thought it was going to be a gun and was terrified, that action is just as bad as attempted murder. Okay, consider that implication of utilitarianism. Now, that means that utilitarianism is a bit morally bankrupt at addressing the issue of intent. And I mean, someone might respond by saying, well, you might want to criminalize attempted murder for lots of very valid reasons, like you want to deter it in the long run. And to that, I say the question is not about whether or not it's right to criminalize it. The question is whether or not it's immoral in the very first place. An average person says, yes, attempted murder is immoral. So let's apply this in this context of free speech, because I think that there's a lot of interesting things that we can garner here. And particularly, I'm going to jump off into a discussion about offense and why we treat offense as morally significant. So the first thought experiment I want to present is this. Let's imagine that someone is a vitriolic racist. They use the most disgusting racial slurs that we think of, the ones that we consider extremely objectionable, things probably like the N-word. But the person is deaf, the victim who is being shouted at. That person is deaf and they don't notice. Their day is not inconvenienced in the slightest. Most people think there's a wrong here. Something bad has happened, but no one has been hurt. Kant would argue that the wrong here is perhaps because we failed to display respect to someone. That's a principled wrong even if there's no one who's hurt, because we have shown a lack of regard for someone's dignity, their humanity, them as an end in and of themselves. And perhaps not in the strict Kantian sense of minimizing their rational will, but in a deontological sense of treating them as subhuman and unworthy of respect. And maybe that's why intention matters so much. It's about the way in which we portray other people, the way we treat them, and how they ought to be treated as a moral end in and of themselves based on their normative status as a human being. That's a lot of words, but what I'm basically saying is that people are valuable irrespective of how much pain or pleasure they feel. They are valuable full stop, which is, I think, a pretty reasonable claim that can be made. Now, I think this also explains a different issue regarding free speech, because an argument that I've heard for protecting free speech is that we only seem to factor some people's offense in. For instance, we don't consider the offense of right-wing conservative groups when they see a Facebook post about gay marriage and are offended, but we do factor in the offense which a vulnerable group with protected characteristics feels when they hear a derogatory comment made against them. And maybe the articulation is this. It's of respect. That when someone makes that Facebook post about gay marriage, there is no intention to try and disrespect someone's attitudes and beliefs in a substantial way. You might say, they're wrong, but you aren't saying they are bad people or that we should minimize their self-worth or moral value as people on the basis of this belief. And in fact, this might be intuitively quite persuasive, because if someone starts harassing or sending death threats to someone who's a conservative who gets offended, most people would say, that probably crosses the bar of being wrong, even if it doesn't materially make their day worse. Like let's say that this person has a really thick skin. Let's say that the person doesn't even read the email or doesn't even read the text that comes out, which has these death threats. Still wrong, probably. Now, if this is the case, we do have to accept unintentional offensive speech. And maybe it's the case that we do, right? If someone says something offensive, they don't realize it's offensive, we don't think they're bad people until we explain it, and then they maintain their same attitudes. That is a very plausible view. If you instead believe that unintentional offensive speech is bad, in the doc there is a little bit, like half a paragraph discussion as to why that might be the case. So I think this is just a very important argument because it ends up applying to so many things. It could apply to free speech, as we've obviously talked about, but the criminal justice system in terms of why we prosecute some crimes based on culpability primarily, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff is about respect and potentially the idea of intention and respect. Yeah. Okay. Fourth topic of discussion, procedural justifications for democracy. And what I mean by this is a procedural justification for democracy is not based on the right to vote leading to good outcomes. Rather, it simply argues that there is a right to vote. And this is the same kind of underlying idea, the relationship, which means that we can enforce things like contracts where people consented but then realize that's probably a bad contract afterwards. It's about the fact that we consented or that we engaged in this relationship, not about the consequential effects of that relationship. So I think the argument for democracy on a procedural level goes like this. The state owes us something because the state is a coercive agent who has robbed you. They're a bandit. It's the same idea as a terrorist group or a militant group who takes control of a village, who ends up governing, even if, for instance, they govern well, they have robbed you in some way of your choices, of your autonomy. And so think about the modern state. It taxes you, it forces you to abide by state power, and oftentimes this is going to happen no matter what. They've already coerced you, or perhaps it's the case that they will never change their policy on X, Y, Z things, even if you have the ability to vote. Now, the reason then why you have a procedural right to vote is that there's an obligation for compensation. You have to have care and regard for each and every citizen and their autonomy in particular because you've stolen from them. And probably you also have a right, an obligation to distribute property or consider their economic needs important precisely because of the fact that you have oftentimes taken their taxation. So the rebuttal to this is just as follows. Doesn't this just mean that there's an obligation for compensation, but not any form of compensation in particular? Like, for instance, why can't we just approximate all the harm they face through money and call it a day? Well, I mean, the answer is that we're trying to return the thing that we robbed precisely. And in this case, what we took away was autonomy, choice, control. What we stole was a person's dignity, their individuality, and their choice. And that is the thing which must be returned, even if not perfectly, through the closest approximation possible. So, if you want a great example of this, Harvard A, WUDC 2016 quarterfinals, makes a great argument along these lines about territory being stolen, that being the thing which is morally salient, autonomy being stolen, all that kind of specificity. This is really important because I think it's what derives these debates about migrant workers having the right to vote, or like the Israeli diaspora having the right to vote within Israel, even if they're just Jewish and not Israeli citizens. Because the question that is posed by this moral theory is not just instrumental. It says you owe certain things to certain people, and you should extend those rights to those people. And it helps fight against the intuition pump, which is like, isn't this just an argument for being utilitarian all the time? And you can say, no, there's actually limitations. So it's a useful argument in most debates about democracy. Okay, final substantive issue before I talk about rebuttal is redistributive justice and taxation. I'm not going to go through the full Rawlsian argument. It's pretty difficult to argue the veil of ignorance in debating. But I think that there are some pieces of Rawls that end up being really, really relevant and important. So Rawls's starting point, and I think one of his most important arguments, is that all of our natural talents, things like, how smart you are, how attractive you are, how tall you are, all that kind of stuff, those things are morally arbitrary. And importantly, those are the things which determine our success. No one deserves to be born as a really smart person. They kind of just are. So as a consequence, Rawls thinks if the only way you get property is through using your natural talents, things like your intelligence, all that kind of stuff, then there is no real property right at all because you aren't morally justified in having any of those things that led to your property. And thus, distributive taxation is just because in the absence of that property right, we should prioritize some metrics. So for all, it's consent behind the veil of ignorance and also a notion of mutual benefit. For others, it could be utilitarianism, etc. So Nozick has a very good set of responses, but I don't think sufficient set of responses to Rawls. And so I want to talk about Michael Sandel a bit, who is very brilliant. He's the one who led that whole Harvard YouTube lecture series called Justice. And he has a really good argument here. He says that Rawls is wrong for a number of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is that there's no good reason why others not deserving something means that I should deserve what they have. The world is just morally arbitrary. That's true. But that is precisely why Bob down the street doesn't have a right over Jane's property, because he did nothing to deserve Jane's property either. And if everything's arbitrary, let's just keep it, how it was designed, how it came out by luck. Because there's no good reason to switch from one morally arbitrary world to another morally arbitrary world. Now, Rawls has a justification that he uses to try and defend this, and says that, there's some kind of right to the property that does exist to the collective group. One of the big things he says is we come together in a society, we work together, we use things like our talents, our labor, we produce a greater pool of societal resources. And therefore, given that we have more than we started with, everyone has an equal claim to that total pot because it was the fruit of our cooperation. Now, Nozick asks, what about the case where there are 10 people? One person has $1 million, everyone else has $5, they all put it in, they get massive financial returns, they end with $2 million. Does it seem like you are actually properly compensating the person who gave in $1 million if you gave them the equal amount of that 2 million total now, so 200,000? Probably not. So Dworkin has a separate solution, and I think it's quite clever, but it's a bit of mental gymnastics. It says that what ties us together are associative obligations that we have. In any community that we view as special, any place where obligations are seen as personal to one another, so I'm obliged directly to another person, and where we're all treated with equal regard, we have an obligation to one another. This can be seen in the family, right? Family is completely morally arbitrary, but the fact that we connote certain special relationships within it, that we acknowledge it as special, that means that we have obligations to that family. It's also a really compelling account as to why abusive families or terrible parents do not have that obligation flowing to them, because they did not partake within that associative obligation. They don't treat you as an equal, right? So that gives us a pretty compelling account there. Why is this important? My interpretation is that there's a benefit that you gain, which is incommensurable. The fact that you gain a source of identity and sense of meaning as a person by being within this community. I'm sure that there are more deontological explanations, but that's my read. Obviously, this is a limited principle because it only applies in certain circumstances. But the idea of mutual benefit is almost too expansive. It means that, for instance, we have huge obligations to people from far away that we do trade with because they help us. The final thing that I want to note about this is this gives us a good reason why we have an obligation to follow the law. If we have an obligation that flows to each and every person within that community, because of the fact that we have derived such large benefits in terms of our identity, then we have an obligation to follow the law that everyone collectively chooses, because I have an obligation to the community as a whole and to each and every individual who has voted for perhaps this law. And that means that in any just democracy, we have an absolute obligation to follow the law, no matter how messed up that law is, so long as it's procedurally decided in the correct way. So that's how you can develop the argument against the common intuition of you should not follow bad laws. Finally, rebuttal to principled arguments. So Lucia does an excellent job of this in her video, and I would certainly recommend that you take a look at that because that's quite helpful. But I do want to cover 2 points that I think could be covered in more depth. I think this is just kind of small stuff, but still important stuff. The first thing is when someone makes a principled argument, they might try and pin something on you. They might say, for instance, aha, if the other side is utilitarian, they have to accept every utilitarian consequence and all the flaws of utilitarianism. So in round 5 of the 2016 HWS round robin, Tel Aviv A runs an extension on the following motion. This House believes that the US should issue guest visas to migrant workers with no minimum wage laws. So Xiao says that democracy is an essential good. And part of what he says for that is that if Proposition was really committed to utilitarianism, they would support the US donating all of its wealth to the developing world. Now, if I was the next government speaker, I'd stand up and just say, well, actually, no, we're not committed to utilitarianism at all. What we're really committed to is the idea of reparations, that we stole territory, property from multiple countries in the world in the past as the United States, that we've imposed war, that we are a neoliberal colonialist is, I think, the language that some people would use. And therefore, we have an obligation to try and return some of that wealth to individuals who have been directly affected. And obviously, we can't do it perfectly, but this is a way in which we meet that moral obligation more, and where it is more likely to have some kind of fulfilling effect to fulfill the obligation that we have. So it's oftentimes useful whenever you have a philosophy pinned on you, particularly when an argument is largely based on saying that that philosophy is wrong, to just repivot and find a different philosophical justification. The second thing, as Lucia points out, is that you can apply other principles. I think it's important to note that morality is oftentimes portrayed as overriding absolute, but lots of people start actually integrating multiple ideas within their moral framework. So lots of utilitarians have backed off and have conceded that things such as beauty or truth matter. There's a good example of how principles are not totalizing all the time within the field of consequentialism. Also, there can be multiple moral principles that exist at once, right? So we have obligations to the state in virtue of the fact that we have obligations to the state and others in virtue of the fact that we have associative obligations. But also we have basic human obligations like not murdering other people that exist regardless of whether or not we're in a state. There are multiple moral principles that exist, and so when they conflict, we have to just figure out which one is actually superior. However, there are some cases where morality does make a claim that it is absolute. It's like the Kantian argument above. It's just saying choice is full stop, the only thing that matters. The rational will is the only thing that matters. Nothing else can even weigh in comparison because nothing else is valuable unless there's rational choice. And if that is true, then it's quite difficult to weigh against that principle. You just have to kind of rebut it head on. So below, you can see some exercises in the doc. I want you to take a look at the following motions. So I want you to just figure out which, if any, of the principled arguments above apply, formulate an argument, and then use thought experiments that are precise to illustrate the claim and really sell it to the judge, make them believe it. Cool. Okay, let's chat about extending on narrow motions now. So before I discuss what exactly the techniques are that I employ, I think it's important to discuss a little bit as to what a narrow motion even is. And in this case, I think what makes a narrow motion in the modern debate judging meta is that the mechanisms which are significant can all be run by the opening team on your bench. And the reason why is because if you propose a new impact that's really large, but it's mechanistically derivative, lots of judges will apply credit to your impact at a discounted rate. It just becomes much smaller and much less important. So that is a significant problem because it basically means that it's really, really difficult to do back half in modern BP. Couple of things I think are pretty useful at being able to deal with this problem. So the first thing is how we frame an impact well, okay? And the important thing is you oftentimes have a new impact that's unrelated to the clash points thus far, but actually relies on the mechanisms from the front half of the debate. And if that's true, as I mentioned before, it's really difficult to get credit for that impacting. So let's imagine this scenario. This house supports the existence of filial responsibility laws. Filial responsibility laws are basically just laws which oblige children to take care of their parents in old age, and when they're sickly, etc. So an argument run in the debate is that this means the elderly are properly provided for, and OG says this means that the welfare of the elderly are ensured by the children rather than creating burdens on the healthcare system or burdens on the welfare state. CG stands up, and perhaps the argument that you want to run in CG is very simple, that the problem that exists is that when you have strains on the financial system through the welfare system or the healthcare system, it can be cataclysmically bad in the modern context of a world in which the baby boomers are reaching an age which allows them to claim pensions, and there aren't enough young people to offset those costs. Likely effects are going to be things like bankruptcy or filing for default, and that means that you're unable to get debt in the future issued at a low rate, yada, 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 like things like austerity, whatever you want to say. And then you might throw in like an intuition pump about like Greece and the benefits that tons of people got there. So there are a lot of links that you have to establish in this argument, but one of the most essential ones has already been established by front half, that this lowers the burden that exists on the healthcare system and welfare system. So the question is, how do you run this impact still? Well, a few things. First, you can just try and weigh the contribution from your impact, but as mentioned before, that will probably happen at a discounted rate. So what are the real strategies then? First, you can establish a new mechanism in the debate to get to that impact. And this means that the judge can basically credit your argument coming to the conclusion of that impact without relying on the front half team. And some judges might just believe that, the philosophical position is the problem with just running an impact is that you've basically piggybacked off the work of an opening half team. But if you've done that mechanistic work, then you can be credited. Awesome. So if that is true, a good example in this case would be something like preventative healthcare. Not only are there less strains on the healthcare system because of the fact that children are spending on their parents, but also creates an incentive for families to live together, to proactively detect things like ailments or illnesses within their parents who are elderly, and then ensure that you don't actually have to have tons of carers for them in hospitals because you can deal with it before it becomes an expensive and difficult problem. So if you do that, then you're maybe able to establish that your argument flows regardless of what happened on the top half. A second thing you can do is deadlock breaking, or undermining the mechanisms that come up for the top half. And I'll describe deadlock breaking more later, but this is kind of just a vague, brief description at the top. So if you can prove that there is an issue mechanistically on the top half that hasn't been proven, or at least the other side has mitigated it sufficiently, even if you only add a link or two, if you can manage to prove that the mechanism is now plausible when previously it was unclear, then you can just run different reasons for that same mechanism and get credited with that mechanistic material, okay? And that means that you have basically won against your top half, or you should, because you have proven their argument. Their argument did not exist or was not fulfilled without you. So that is usually quite helpful. You can also undermine their mechanism. Like you can say, their mechanism applies in most cases, our mechanism applies in this number of cases, therefore our impact fully flows from our argumentation. So like for instance, if you have the solution of, so if front half has the solution of caring for the elderly as a way to not have large economic costs, you might say, well, the problem is it displaces women from the workforce to take care of ailing elderly people, which has a negative financial effect. And in these kinds of cases, like within certain types of families who can't afford nannies, for instance, it's only the CG that can win by proving that there are no health complications in the first place. So, you can do that and just try and undermine their mechanism, say it doesn't apply in all cases. We apply in these cases, we claim the benefit solely in those cases. Second, just note, sometimes mechanisms work incrementally. So for instance, the opening might have already proven that something happens, but they haven't proven that happens to a large degree. So they can prove there's a reduced strain on the healthcare system, but they haven't proved that the reduced strain is large enough or is so large that any additional reduction that will not be relevant or important. So you can say, Look, we've proven that the impacts that OG has are much larger because we reduce the strain by a significantly larger degree, but we also have this new impact that we mentioned. And then you can just be like, the only reason why the government case was made winning by was by our material, therefore we deserve to win. Okay, second, on deadlock breaking. So another strategy in closing basically depends entirely on how close the round was and basically how good your judging is. If you determine that your front half has not won a clash, and it's really essential, and you're able to decisively win that point of clash, then you can just win by extending on the same issue and proving it. But importantly, you can't win if you extend upon an important issue that's already been won from your front half. And the reason why is because it's really unclear how important your contribution actually is in the round. So it's important to tell when clash points have been won or lost, because, I mean, if it hasn't been lost and you try and extend upon it and make it deeper, you've just given some extra reasons why it's true, but not proven that it's true when it was otherwise false. Okay? So there are two things that you oftentimes want to consider when you break these deadlocks. First, how plausible is the argument? Like, do you think it's going to happen? And second, how impactful it is. And usually the first is most important, because even if you demonstrate a claim is really impactful, like the risk of nuclear war, that happens only like 0.01% of the time, it becomes super difficult to weigh that argument within the round. So in those instances, if you can just prove the argument is plausible, you've probably gone all the way in winning the round. There are also some cases where both the top half teams have shown their arguments are plausible, but it's unclear how exactly we should weigh those arguments. And from back half, your job isn't to weigh the arguments. You need to actually add some analysis. Your job is to show that the margins of the arguments have changed. So you can mitigate the other team's arguments or by increasing the impacts on your own side. Okay? And when you're doing all this, just be very, very explicit, saying that there's a deadlock on the front half, or this was a missing premise that didn't prove anything. It's unclear who on top half has won this debate. Something like that, and just say we're going to decisively show you that the op bench has won. Okay. So in that instance, let me give you an example of something that's kind of similar, or an instance which has happened. So a good example of this happening would be in a motion like this House, as the Iranian government would fulfill its obligations under the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal, where Iran agreed to stop producing nuclear weapons and bring their nuclear enrichment facilities to below a certain threshold in order to have sanctions lifted against it. So imagine the opening half of the debate. So OG says that following the obligations that exist under it will prevent the EU from sanctioning Iran. If the EU did sanction Iran, what would happen is economic collapse and regime change from revolution. OO says that economic harm isn't that large because there's still trade that exists between China, Russia, and Iran, and the EU is irrelevant. The OG then says that economic trade between Iran, China, and Russia just isn't sufficient to maintain economic stability, and that Iran needs to stay in the EU's good books. So this seems like a bit of a deadlocked argument, because at the end of the day, it ends up being about factual claims that our intuitions will lean on, but with no proof. Like, for instance, is it enough to have trade between China, Russia, and Iran? Like, it could be. China's pretty big, but also, it's only 3 countries. So that's kind of the mental exercise that a judge has in their brain. It becomes difficult for them to judge. So the CEO can break this deadlock by just extending on the same issue, on economics. And they can just say, well, US sanctions also apply secondary sanctions. That prevents countries in the EU from being able to trade with Iran because otherwise they'll also be penalized. And therefore, compliance with the JCPOA is irrelevant, because who we need to persuade is not the EU. Who we need to persuade is the US. And they're just never going to budge. They're quite resistant. And give XYZ reason why. In comparison, Russia does defy the secondary sanctions. They don't have much to lose. They don't care about the US. Therefore, you get enough economic mitigation and benefit, but also none of the prop material is relevant or important in the round. And CEO can win this debate by then just saying this proves that the economic harm that occurs will not be solved by the proposition, and therefore the proposition loses on all the economic clash. You might even want to be like, insofar as you think the economic clash was the most important clash in the debate, we have won this debate. So you can be that explicit if you want, although I personally think it's a little bit inelegant. So in that instance, Xiao can win. They might take a second. In the case that they take a second, if you even run a small extension, I think that you probably would take the first anyways. So even a small new argument that isn't that relevant, combined with all this material, might be sufficient. Okay, the final thing I want to chat about is establishing a new comparative. And the final thing that is useful about this is that it means that you can cut out the vast majority of the opening debate, or at the very least, your side's opening, and position yourself with better relevance, even if your arguments aren't much stronger or aren't on a new issue. So this either comes from identifying comparative based on what the motion outlines. This works very often. You can watch the Euros 2014 finals to see how it happens. Or you can analyze what harms are symmetric. So basically what harms apply on either side of the house just based on logic. So let me give you some examples. At Worlds this year, the round 2 was this house supports the rapid global elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. We were in CG, and the OG did a great job of talking about the benefits of free trade, establishing that free trade lowered costs. The barriers to trade were often based on political reasons, that small countries get hurt by protectionism and being excluded from the trade arena, etc., etc., etc. In CG, our strategy was just to reestablish the comparative. We said that the status quo already had regional trade blocks, which means that the vast majority of the OG benefits of free trade already flowed from the status quo. So what was the distinction then? The distinction was that the notion of trade becoming global gives small states who are bullied in trading agreements right now more leverage because they have more options to choose from. And that means that the people in those countries are better off and those countries are better off overall. This was really, really effective in the round because it just meant that a lot of the top half case was washed out based on the context of the round. And it meant that we got a leg up in terms of relevance. Second example, this is more so to do with just proving symmetry. So this happened in a round that I did with Kit in round 5 of Athens Open this last year. The motion was this house would legalize all drugs, and the top half of the round was what one could expect and what we did expect. OG talked about the benefits that came from having safer and regulated drugs, the ability to report drug overdoses, all that stuff. The OO argued for decriminalization and argued that it was wrong to encourage drug use. So Kit and I just ran a really simple case. We just said almost everything on the top half was symmetric. Given the fact that an incredible number of people would have safer drugs, but also that there was increased use of drugs, it was quite difficult to see how large the change was in terms of saving users' lives. What was really important was instead the supply side. The drug cartels that coerce farmers, that distribute drugs into the market, and that use the profits for things like weaponry, arms, and other undesirable activities. And so we said, all of the top half harms are largely symmetric. They miss the comparative. The real comparative in this debate, the place where things really change is on the supply side. Now, this seems a little bit odd because OO gave the counterfactual immediately, but imagine if OO didn't say this. On CG, you could just stand up and say there are lots of places where drugs are already decriminalized, and that is increasingly the trend within the developed world. That means that the OG harms are not that significant, but also any OO harms about why it is the case that usage is bad are also not significant, and therefore the only relevant impact is what we have in CG. You can also be more subtle. You can say like OG does prove to you that there's going to be safer drugs and that outcomes will be better, but we do recognize that many of these benefits do already flow in the status quo and that the improvements that we get from OG are present but marginal. Where the big change in this debate is on the supply side. And that way you never sound like you're knifing. You never say your top half is wrong or the impacts don't apply. You just say that they're smaller or less relevant, and then you can probably run your case. All right, so practice for this. Easiest practice, honestly, just practice giving member speeches in real rounds or practice giving member speeches whenever you watch a round online. But there's a hypothetical scenario below that you can practice on and do an extension on. Awesome. Okay, let's move on to talk about Fiat. And this is the final thing that I'm going to discuss in the workshop today. So the question is, how do we properly use a side's fiat in order to win a debate? To be clear, a fiat in debating is the ability for a team to say something will happen without quibbling over the practical constraints in the real world of how likely it would be to be implemented. So let's say the motion is this House would abolish the UN. You just have to assume that the government bench can abolish the UN, right? Even if it's infeasible in the real world. Not only that, in terms of assuming the practicality of doing something, but Fiat also gives OG the ability to specify how they can do things. So like in the World's Round 3 this year, this House would allow children to sue parents for religious indoctrination. OG gets the right to specify things like what the standard of proof would be, what constitutes religious indoctrination, what level of intent is required for the parents to be liable, etc. Just as a cautionary note, this is only really applicable in this House would motions. Arguably in some this House believes that motions, but not tons. It's difficult. This House believes that issue is mostly that in order to say an actor should do something, you have to say this House believes that X actor would do Y. Because if you say this House as X actor would do Y, then that becomes an actor motion. So the only way in which you can get a specific actor doing something rather than generally governments is by using this House believes that motion. So I think some this House believes that motions are intended to have fiat, some aren't. It's really messy and should be clarified at some point, but hopefully that'll get done. Anyways, the point of fiat is it grants OG a lot of influence in the debate. It just gives them the ability to be able to decide what's happening. But, similarly, the opposition gets similar amounts of influences because they get the same amount of resources, be it things like political will, the willingness of the population or legislators to vote for something, or, financial resources. The opposition gets the amount that the government uses and can place it in anything else. And this becomes really important for counterpropping, which I'll demonstrate in a moment. But a good example of this is in a motion like this House would abolish the UN. With this House would abolish the UN, you might get the circumstance in which you can run on a counterprop that you would just reform the UN. So for instance, you would remove the permanent 5 or you'd make it rotating or you get rid of the veto, something like that. I do want to point out that you have to be careful when you use fiat because you might accidentally cut out your own arguments. So if you run something on opposition like we would reform the UN, but then you also say the UN is a necessary structure so that you can intervene in wars, but also so that you can mediate international conflicts and prevent them from boiling out through having a diplomatic means of doing so, your arguments on reforming the process might mitigate that because it might be the case that those are the things which allow for diplomatic resolution rather than military resolution. So you do want to consider that in terms of counterpropping, limiting your own arguments. So I'm going to lay out a couple of different steps for counterpropping and then talk about how we for using fiat. And then I'm going to talk about how exactly we combat the effective use of fiat. So what ought we consider with fiat? There's some natural constraints that exist with using fiat. That's something that's really important to note because as I noted before, you minimize your own arguments. Not only that, but you're also taking a lot of time to develop a nice and detailed model or counterprop. So that's time in the prep room that ends up being lost. So really you should only be doing this if the other side's arguments are very persuasive and very powerful. How do you decide this? Well, 4 steps. First, you do all the basic model stuff. What does the world look like? How does it change? Should have been taught that already. Second, you think about your own side's best arguments. Then you think about the other side's best arguments. Then you think about whether or not it is worth it to be able to limit their arguments at the expense of limiting your own. Okay? And then, if possible, you also want to think about how you limit their best arguments without negatively affecting your own best arguments. So step 4 and 5, they're kind of related. You have to figure out whether or not you can. If you can't, is it worth it? It's a really simple system, but it actually gives you the ability to completely cut the other side out of the debate through preemption. And it really simplifies the debate. It reduces the number of arguments that can be run, which is really advantageous in the comparison between you and the back half teams. And it also makes it easy to weigh arguments because if you know there are a limited number of arguments, you can just weigh directly against the only claim that the other bench has now. So let's look at a few examples of using Fiat in WDC from this year. So there are two motions where I think it's really important. The first one is on this House would ban the Olympic Games. And here an OO team should probably stand up and have a really detailed counterprop prepared. And the reason why is because the Gov has some pretty good arguments about human slavery being used in construction processes for the Olympics and the economic harms that come from impoverished or low development countries engaging in the Olympics and incurring debt. So counterprop could look like this. The bidding process is reformed, so only countries which have strong and stable economies with a debt to GDP ratio of below 50% can bid. There's a prohibition on the use of illegitimate labor during the construction process. There's always an alternate bid prepared in a country which previously held the Olympics, so that if there are any violations of the conditions outlined, a replacement country can be granted the Olympics. Any corruption within the IOC will be harshly monitored. The finances of each member of the IOC committee will be carefully scrutinized. There'll be independent instructors who participate in from nations who participate in the Olympics who investigate things like the use of illegitimate labor. This is a very detailed and thorough model. And the reason why you have some of the specificity is just to prevent them saying that your model won't work. And I'm going to get to how you would do that. But for instance, the prop team can just claim, well, actually, the system is too corrupt. Like, unfortunately, the IOC is just so corrupt that you can't effectively do these things, because if you give them discretion over what is an acceptable debt to GDP ratio to host the Olympics, they will just change it for whatever country has bribed them that year. And so for you to set a specific target like debt to GDP ratios below 50% can bid and anything above can't, that just makes sure that they can't try and weasel their way around implementation by saying, you can set up the formal structures, but you can't make sure that does it right. This is a great model, I think. It becomes very, very difficult for Gov to run the arguments that they might want to run. So example number 2. Let's say the motion is, in liberal democracies, this House would implement a social credit system. And in this motion, you basically have a discussion as to whether or not this is fair for minority groups or people who are reported upon. To be clear, a social credit system is basically what was proposed by China a few years ago. And you can find the info slide on hellomotions.com. But basically, the idea of the motion is that you have a system where people are reported on for doing good or bad deeds, and they get rewarded in their society by having tax breaks or things like that if they do good deeds, and they get punished if they do bad things. Punished by, for instance, having longer queues in the healthcare waiting lists or higher mortgage payments, stuff like that. So here is a model that you can use. And specifically, you want to mitigate the problems of discrimination, where op is going to stand up and say, if a white person is standing outside of a business, that's fine. If a black person stands outside of a business, they're going to be reported for loitering because of biases. So the way we deal with this on Gov is through this. First, you say that all reports in the social credit system would be reviewable by the individual who it is reported against. And then there would be an appeals committee composed of a perfectly representative board in terms of ethnicity, gender, sexuality, all characteristics, basically. Then you have that appeals committee monitored by a larger, higher level appeals committee, similar to a Supreme Court, that also has perfect representation. The second thing you could say is that the circumstances of individuals and the crime are taken into account. And if an individual is committing an economic crime due to poverty or litters in a community with no public bins, there's no negative effect to their social credit account or score. And then if there is systematic bias, which is demonstrated in the reports, all negative reports against the minority groups who the bias is against will have no impact on them. So what's left is a Gov case which says we should punish privileged people when they do bad things and reward all people when they do good things. Makes it really tough for op to make arguments in this case. And again, it's really critical that you're super detailed and specific, because if you try and just magic wand it and say our appeals board will always catch every single process. The response is just like, what if the appeals committee is itself biased? Or if they try and magic wand the debate by saying something like, well, we will just reduce the amount of punishment or social credit loss to someone who is low income and does something wrong, then the response is just, but it still affects them massively because there'll be lots of people reporting them or lots of reports still, and lots of small effects add up to a big effect. So this model is really, really important because it just helps you from the very top deal with any potential complaints from the other side. And the more specific it is, the earlier, if it's specific at an early point, that's really important because the disadvantage of LO or PM is that you say your counterprop or your model, and then you can't modify it. And then there are 4 or 3 speakers after you who have the opportunity to just keep on explaining why it's stupid or what the flaws with it are. So yeah, that's tough. Okay, how do we deal with Fiat, a team that really tightly defines things? Seems nearly impossible to deal with, but the most important thing is you just argue that the government or the opposition has the fiat to implement these structures formally, but they can't argue that they are done well automatically. They need to prove that through analysis. So all the examples I gave above, like for instance in banning the Olympic Games, you have the problem of corruption. Corruption can mean that you are able to subvert any subjective decision that is made by these boards or these groups because, for instance, determining an appropriate debt to GDP ratio is an inherently political issue. And that means that the corruption that occurs will inherently limit your ability to effectively do this. That's really bad. That, I think, is a pretty basic example, but there are also things that you can argue in terms of inherent problems that exist regardless of human structures. So in this debate, you can have the problem where the GDP of a state can radically change. For instance, the volatile commodities market, which has seen oil drop massively, could be a huge influence on a country that chooses to host it. They've incurred lots of debt, they've built stadiums, and there is still a massive risk. So for instance, the fact that the Gov did not model out like countries with volatile commodities markets means that there's still harm. So if Gov was really clever and could model out everything, then like maybe there's just no debate and Gov just, if Op is able to counter Prop and just model out everything, maybe there's just no debate and Op wins. But it's really unlikely that they can think of everything within 15 minutes while still having an argument that is relevant or salient to the round. So there are natural constraints, which mean that they will probably miss things, and that you can always argue that there are inherent or human factors that prevent the implementation of the policy properly. Okay, so in terms of activities, I have 3 activities below. You're going to develop a model or counterprop on the following motions that I've listed. Great. So thank you everyone for listening, and apologies for anyone who was tuning in earlier and the live stream was not working sufficiently. I also apologize if I seem tired or rushed through things the second time around, just because I had just done it about 30 minutes prior to starting this one. So I might have some blind spots in that sense. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the group. It's actually probably best to post them in the group because if you, in the Facebook event, but it's probably best to post it in the Facebook event because if you do so, then everyone can see the response to it, and therefore everyone continues to learn more, which is always very, very good. And finally, again, massive thank you to everyone who has helped out with this lecture, directly Darian, but also good chats with other really, really clever debaters like Harish or Arth, who've really helped inform some of my debate views and some of the articulations of the things that I've talked about today. So all the good things, attribute to them. All the bad things, attribute to me, please. Have a lovely day. I hope you're staying safe in quarantine and that all is well.